Good morning, everyone. This is Director Bishotsky, co-chair of the Governor's Drought Interagency Coordinating Group. Thank you for attending the fall meeting of the ICG. Before we start, I would like to ask Nemesis Ortiz to go over the webinar logistics to assure that our virtual meeting will go as smoothly as possible. Go ahead, Nemesis.
Thank you. Please, everyone, mute yourselves when you're not speaking. If you would like to speak, please type your name in the chat and we will call on people to speak through the meeting. You can also type your questions, comments on the chat if you prefer, and we will read and respond to those throughout the meeting. If you have any technical difficulties, please contact ADWR Help Desk at 602-771-8444, or you can email tickets at azwater.gov. Thank you.
Thanks, Nemesis. We have the agenda up on the board. Hopefully all the members of the group also have the agenda for their own purposes. Again, I'm Director Bishotsky, the co-chair of the group. We also have Jean Wickel, the Senior Assistant Director of the Arizona Division of Emergency Management, representing Mr. Alan Clark, the group's co-chair for this meeting. So welcome, Jean. This group has met biannually since 2006 to make a recommendation to the governor about whether to maintain the drought emergency declaration, which has been in place since June 1999. The ICG is an advisory group to the governor, composed of over 20 federal and state agencies and some tribal communities as well. After the presentation, we will discuss and decide on a recommendation. And members, to avoid speaking over one another, please introduce yourselves using the chat box. Add your name and who you represent for all participants to see. And so we also will have a record of who attended the meeting. We'll have a series of presentations as we do in the normal course of business. But before we start the presentations, again, introducing Dr. Erin Saffel, who was appointed state climatologist by Governor Doug Ducey this year. Welcome, Dr. Saffel, and congratulations on your appointment. And then we will start with agenda item number 3, the drought status update and monitoring technical committee activities. And Dr. Saffel will lead us through that discussion. Take it away.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your introduction and thank you for your time. I'm, as the new state climatologist for Arizona and the co-chair of the Drought Monitoring Technical Committee, I'm happy to speak to this group and talk about the status of short and long-term drought this past water year. Next slide. We'll start with the status of the upper and lower Colorado basins. The 6 maps listed together show the seasonal fall and winter precipitation for each of the last 6 water years, starting with water year 2016 in the upper left corner. As we progress, water year 2021 is listed in the lower right corner. It shows the very low levels of fall and winter precipitation received this past water year for the lower Colorado River Basin, with the majority of Arizona receiving less than 50% of seasonal precipitation. The larger map on the left side of the screen is showing seasonal precipitation for this past October, with portions of central and southern Arizona less than 30% seasonal averages. Next slide, please. Locations along the Mogollon Rim and northeastern Pima County had the highest amounts of precipitation across the state during water year 2021. The map on the left shows that these locations received up to 150% of average amounts for water year 2021. Western and northern counties received below average amounts of precipitation for water year 2021. Next slide, please. Total statewide precipitation during water year 2021 was below average at 10.69 inches. This map shows water year 2021 precipitation per county, with the most precipitation received in Gila County. This was largely due to the exceptional monsoon precipitation along the Mogollon Rim. Several locations, including Basin and Show Low, received their wettest monsoon on record. Next slide, please. This map is showing county rankings for the water year based on a period of record that extends to 1895. While the monsoon was exceptional this past summer, it only brought central and southern counties to near normal conditions. Pima County was able to move water year 2021 into the top third rankings. Mojave County experienced its 10th driest water year on record. Next slide, please. The MTC works with the Drought Monitor each week to verify impacts and assess short and long-term drought conditions in our state. This time series shows the percentage of the state experiencing drought per year since 2000. The colors demonstrate the type of drought from moderate to exceptional. This past water year had the largest spread of exceptional drought in the period of record. The period of record is the last 21 years. Next slide, please. It can help to see the types and locations of drought with these maps. The maps encompass water years 2020 and 2021. June 2020 shows that the highest level of drought at that time was D2, severe drought. The winter precipitation for 2019 to 2020 helped mitigate much of the drought at that time. 2020's monsoon season was one of the driest monsoon seasons on record. That built extreme drought across much of the state. Winter precipitation for 2020 to 2021 was also very low, allowing exceptional drought to build across the state in June of 2021. From the strong precipitation this past monsoon, most of the state was able to rebound by the end of the water year. Next slide. These charts are showing the same information we just saw on the maps, but it quantifies the different levels and extent of drought. Abnormally dry conditions are not considered to be drought, and in June of 2020, 86% of the state was not in drought. 1 year later, 87% of the state was in extreme or exceptional drought. What we're seeing in these numbers are short-term drought impacts. Next slide, please. There are many tools to understand long-term drought. One way is to evaluate statewide precipitation per water year. The average amount of precipitation per water year since 1901 is 12.6 inches. Some water years are above average, but many of the water years since 1995 have been below average, including water year 2021. Next slide, please. The Standardized Precipitation Index, or SPI, shows precipitation at different timescales as a means to identify aspects of short and long-term drought. SPI values are calculated for timescales of 1 month through 60 months. And these are calculated for each month starting January 1981 through September 2021. While short-term drought improved from the summer's precipitation, dry conditions continued across much of the state for water year 2021. Next slide, please. The Standardized Precipitation Evapotranspiration Index, or SPEI, brings together precipitation and potential evapotranspiration. Potential evapotranspiration considers temperature and wind conditions that influence aspects of water loss. Long-term drought is analyzed monthly from the previous 24, 36, and 48-month periods. The start of water year 2021 saw extreme long-term drought, largely within the northeastern counties. Very dry winter conditions in 2020-2021 expanded extreme long-term drought over much of the state by April. There was also an increase of exceptional long-term drought in the northern and eastern counties. At the end of water year 2021, exceptional long-term drought remained in central Mojave County, eastern Coconino County, western and central Navajo County, and eastern Apache County. Next slide, please. Thank you for your time. I'd like to invite everyone to join our workshop in December to hear talks from members of the Drought Monitor, explaining tools that you can use to identify impacts of drought. You can go to my website to register. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Staffel. Do we have any members who have entered their names in the chat to ask questions?
No, we have not.
So, Doctor, I do have one question, and not to put you on the spot, and you may not have the answer. Wondering how in the upper Colorado Basin the precipitation has been so far this fall.
When we're looking at the chart, and we can actually go and move back to that second slide, it'll show you October, which is what we have. And so that'll show you the current, and you'll see the upper basin is, yeah, so it's the second, sorry, you have to go all the way back.
Yeah, yeah. Keep going.
Yeah, there it is. So if we're looking over on this left side where it says Colorado Basin, right underneath that, you can see the upper basin, and you can see that it's doing okay at this point in time. It's not in the bright magenta that we're experiencing here in the southern portion in the lower basin. And so there's hope when we're looking at, and I think we're going to have folks talk about La Nina. Perhaps the upper basin might be able to have a little bit more precipitation, but we'll see what our folks say about that.
Thank you, and I partly bring it up because, and we'll hear maybe this later, we did see last year runoff in the Colorado River system of only 32%, while we had snowpack peaking at 89%, largely because of all of the red on the map in the upper basin last year too, and the dry soil conditions and other situations. So I think it's really critical to monitor what's happening in the upper basin to see if the soil is getting wetted in time for hopefully lots of snow and runoff next spring. So thank you for your presentation. Thank you for answering that question. We'll move on then to item 4, the weather outlook for the winter 2021 to 2022. And Mark O'Malley, the lead forecaster for the National Weather Service and co-chair of the Drought Monitoring Technical Committee, will give us that presentation. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you very much, Director Brushatsky. My name is Mark O'Malley, and I'm a forecaster and climate specialist with the National Weather Service and co-chair of the Drought Monitoring and Technical Committee. So if we go to the next slide, unfortunately, we're looking at another winter of La Nina. That's what we had last year. And what is La Nina? Well, La Nina is cooler than normal waters that pool along the equatorial Pacific. And in this loop, you can see how those dark blue colors, the cooler waters, become darker, more intense, and more expansive with time as we head through the fall. So we are already in weak La Nina, and the confidence is very high that we're going to continue in this La Nina phase through the winter. We're already seeing the effects of this pattern. It's been very dry, as Erin showed, in much of the Southwest, but the Northwest United States has been exceptionally wet so far. Parts of California, which has been experiencing extreme to exceptional drought, have had some good water early in the year that has not quite got over to the upper Colorado Basin. The snowpack in some of that basin has been fairly good so far, though. If we go to the next slide. As I said, the models we use show very high confidence, better than 90% chance that we stay in this La Nina through the spring. We're already established in the La Nina. Subjectively, the pattern I'm seeing is already very La Nina-like. And intensity in the models we use, if you look at the bottom left-hand graph, is we're kind of straddling that weak to moderate event. Last year, we were solidly in moderate La Nina. When it comes to the impacts in Arizona, the difference between weak and moderate really isn't that great. Unfortunately, any La Nina is a dry forecast for Arizona. So if we go to the next slide, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this slide because it's very important. In the upper left, there's a modest chance that it will be warmer than average this winter in the Southwest United States. And that is supported by this composite of all the La Ninas over the past 40 years, which show that some of the South Central United States tend to be warmer during these La Nina years. But the really important graph is the one in the bottom right-hand corner. And that shows our trend in temperatures over since 1950. And I don't think it takes a scientist to look and see, yes, we're dealing with these rising temperatures. All the red dots are the past La Ninas. So compared to this new 1991 to 2020 normal, and this is literally a new normal by the colloquialism, we dropped the years 1981 to 1990 and replaced them with the years 2011 to 2020. So what does that do if you click ahead one more? In that bottom right screen, notice the old normal is in that blue line. Our new normal is actually a half a degree warmer. And this is important when you look at what happened last year compared to the old normal. Last winter was a little bit warmer than average. Now the new normal last year was near average. So how this goes in the future, we've seen this for the past 30, 40 years now, what this trend is doing. And if you click to the next slide and look at the top right graph, that's the fingerprint of climate change. That's what La Nina looked like compared to the old normals, but the new normals, it's changed significantly. This is very important in going forward. I've been doing this 10 years, and looking forward 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, when we're making plans for the future, we need to consider that these normals are going to continue to rise. Our temperatures are going to continue to rise. And very appropriately in the House testimony that Director Bushatsky gave, a lot of the witnesses were using the term aridification. That is very accurate for the Southwest. Again, it doesn't take a scientist to tell you that if you have warmer temperatures, you're going to evaporate more water. You're going to bake out the soils quicker. You're going to dry out the vegetation quicker. These are all impacts we need to plan for 20, 30 years in advance, given these warming temperatures. So go on to the next slide, and we'll start to look at what precipitation has looked like in recent La Nina winters. And for Arizona, it's generally not great. There's an exception always in there. 2016-17 was a fairly good year for Arizona. But even that year, the southern part of the state was below average. Possibly a hint of good news in this is the upper Colorado Basin. During these La Nina events, it's a very mixed bag. As Director Bushatsky said last year, it was about 80% normal. It wasn't horrible. If you look through some of these maps, there has been years where the upper basin has fared okay, but there's other years where it hasn't. So for Arizona, the odds are definitely tilted towards drier than average, but the upper basin, it's probably more of a 50-50 shot in that respect. So if we go to the next slide, this is our precipitation outlook. And again, for the Southwest, really focused into Arizona, the odds of 40 to 50% chance that will be below average for the winter. But those odds taper off fairly quickly as you head to the upper basin. And when you look at the top right graph, you can really see how that gradient between Arizona and then Utah and Colorado. There can be some years, like I said, that are fairly good up there. But looking at the bottom right graph, this is the winter Arizona precipitation. And again, the red dots are previous La Nina years. And it's pretty obvious that over the past 30 years, some of our driest winters, almost all of them have been La Ninas. There's only very few La Nina winters in Arizona that end up towards the near to slightly above normal category. So when it comes down to it, for us in Arizona, if we get a near normal year this year, that would be a real win for us. So go to the next slide. And this is the same graph, except in the bottom right, it's focused on the upper Colorado Basin. And as I was talking about earlier, far more variable. Yes, there have been some very dry La Nina years, but there have been some wet La Nina years in that part of the world as well. So we can still hold out a little bit of hope that we get enough of the jet stream dipping down into that area to produce enough good snow events so we do get a good snowpack. Go to the next slide, please. And this is touching on a little bit of the soil moisture that's been an issue for us the past couple years. The top left graph is the precipitation we saw over the monsoon as a percent of normal. For all of us in central Arizona, we know how wet it was, very beneficial for us. But if you look into the upper part of the basin, it was a little bit more of a mix. There were some areas that did okay, but it was not necessarily as wet in that area. So for Arizona, we have kind of the bonus that that monsoon moisture that really soaks through a deep soil layer may be beneficial for us in future runoff. Now, unfortunately, the past month or so has been extremely dry, and that has not really helped the soil. So we'll have to see going forward in the Salt and Verde Basin this winter how well that responds. At the end of the monsoon, we were getting very good response off of the stream flow, and you'll hear some information from Stephen Flora on that. But we'll see if this dry spell is not helping us out. In the upper basin, it remains to be seen whether we got enough saturation and if this early season snowpack that we're getting up there is going to help us out at all going forward. So that remains to be seen. Go to the next slide, please. So this is just a quick summary. I won't stay on this that long, but it's basically La Nina. It's a second La Nina winter. And historically, our odds are definitely shifted towards drier than normal for the winter in Arizona. The upper basin can do better. It may be a little bit warmer than average, but the odds aren't shifted that well in that direction given the new normals. And then the soil moisture is a big deal. Again, we will hear the testimony coming up from both the Colorado Basin and the Salt Verde Basin, how that soil moisture is really important on the runoff that we get. And we were really hurt last year by that. So maybe it might be a little better this year, but we will see. And go to the last slide, just for my advertisement. If you need any information from the Weather Service, there's a telephone number. There's my email address if you need to contact me at all for any questions. Thank you very much for your time, and I will take any questions if anybody has any.
Thank you, Mark. We'll pause a second for members to ask questions through the chat process.
There are no questions.
We are not seeing any questions pop up. Thanks again, Mark. We'll move on then to the next item. Item number 5 on the agenda, a Colorado River water supply update from Rachel Von Nechten from the Department of Water Resources, Colorado River Management Section. Go ahead, Rachel.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. All right, I'm going to give the Colorado River update status. Next slide, please. We'll start with a brief review of the Colorado River System reservoir status for November. These numbers reflect the levels of November 3rd. For the smaller upper basin reservoirs, beginning at the upper right and moving down, we have Fontenelle at 67%, Flaming Gorge at 78%, Blue Mesa at 25%, followed by Morrow Point at 93%, and finally Navajo at 52%. As of the 3rd, Lake Powell was at an elevation of 3544.12 feet with a storage of 7.172 million acre feet, or 29% of capacity. Lake Mead was at elevation 1066.36 feet with a storage of 8.913 million acre-feet, or 39% of capacity. From checking the Bureau's website this morning, Powell and Mead elevations have only moved approximately 0.42 feet each. Looking at the reservoir system as a whole, we currently have roughly 22.5 million acre-feet in storage, or 37% of system capacity. This is approximately a 5.7 million acre-feet decrease from this time last year. Next slide, please. Here we have the snow water equivalent chart for above Lake Powell. The 1991 to 2020 median is shown in purple, and we have our current year 2021 in blue. This year we peaked on March 30th at 89% of median. For comparison, I've included last year in green, 2012 in red, and 2002 in light blue. Out of the worst years for April through July unregulated inflow to Powell, 2002 ranks number 1 at 0.964 million acre-feet. 1977 ranks number 2 at 1.208 million acre-feet, and 2012 ranked number 3 at 2.063 million acre-feet. However, 2021 replaced the third worst April through July unregulated inflow at 1.834 million acre-feet. In addition, soil conditions were extremely dry, which is why the 89% of snowpack only translated to an annual inflow volume percentage in the low 30s. Next slide, please. These show the end of calendar year 2021 projections for Lakes Powell and Mead. These are based on the October 24-month study. We have Lake Powell ending the calendar year at 3535.36 feet, or 6.58 million acre-feet of storage, 27% of capacity. And Lake Mead ending at 1066.06 feet, or 8.89 million acre-feet of storage, 34% of capacity. Next slide. Here we are looking at the 24-month study again, but now looking to the end of water year 2022. The projection for Lake Powell is to end water year 2022 at 3534.18 feet, 6.51 million acre-feet of storage, 27% of capacity. Lake Powell is projected to end water year 2022 at 1052.43 feet, or 7.86 million acre-feet of storage, 30% of capacity. Reclamation has announced a 7.48 million acre-feet release from Powell to Mead for water year 2022, and the next slide will explain why. This is an operational table of the coordinated operations of Lakes Powell and Mead. These operations are put into place by the August 24-month study. The August 24-month study projected Lake Powell at elevation 3535.40 feet on January 1, 2022, which is below elevation 3575 feet. This means Lake Powell will release 7.48 million acre-feet in water year 2022. The August 24-month study projected Lake Mead at elevation 1065.85 feet on January 1, 2022, placing Lake Mead below the Tier 1 shortage line of 1075 feet. In Tier 1, according to the 2007 interim guidelines and 2019 drought contingency plan, Arizona will take a 512,000 acre-foot reduction in 2022. Next slide, please. Looking at the projected elevations at Lake Powell from the October 24-month study, we have the October most probable in green, the maximum probable shown in blue, and the min probable in red. The first vertical gold line marks the end of calendar year 2021. The end of calendar year 2021 most probable elevation is projected at 3535.36 feet, with a min to max range of 3535.28 to 3535.44 feet. The second vertical line marks the end of calendar year 2022. The end of calendar year 2022 most probable elevation projection for Lake Powell is at 3528.0 feet, with a min-max range of 3482.53 to 3608.84 feet. Just to note, the end of month projected elevations for both Lakes Powell and Mead for the 24-month study assume the releases pursuant to the DROA agreement, but do not make any further assumptions of such releases. Next slide, please. Now looking at Lake Mead, end-of-month elevation projections from the October 24-month study. The first gold line marks the end of calendar year 2021. The most probable elevation is projected at 1066.06 feet with a min to max range of 1065.79 to 1066.74 feet. The second vertical gold line marks the end of calendar year 2022. The end of calendar year 2022 most probable elevation projection ends Mead at 1050.63 feet with a min to max range of 1047.86 to 1061.17 feet. The minimum probable projection forecasts a 7.0 million acre-feet release from Powell in water year 2023, while the most probable forecast a 7.82 million acre-feet release, and the maximum probable forecast a release of 9.0 million acre-feet. Next slide, please. Moving on to the chance of reservoir operating conditions table at Lake Mead. Lake Mead will be operated in a Tier 1 shortage condition based on determination from the August 24-month study. Based on projections from the August model run, there's a 94% probability of shortage in 2023. These are further broken down as a 78% probability of another first-level shortage condition, with a 16% chance of a second-level shortage condition. Looking into the out years from the August run projections, we see probabilities of shortage determinations remaining above 90%. In 2025 and 2026, Reclamation projects a 41% probability of falling into a third-level shortage elevation. Next slide. Before I conclude my update, I do just want to note that the Bureau of Reclamation has updated its 30-year period of record used to compare unregulated inflows into Lake Powell. Reclamation had previously been using volumes from 1981 to 2010, and it is now using volumes from 1991 to 2020. The 1981-2010 Lake Powell unregulated inflow average was 10.83 million acre-feet. The Lake Powell unregulated inflow average for the updated 30-year period, 1991 to 2020, is now 9.6 million acre-feet. This is important to note when looking at numbers comparing unregulated inflows to this 30-year average. That concludes my update, and on that note, I can take any questions. For your reference, I've included some useful links to resources to keep tabs on forecasts and operations as the new water year gets on its way. Thank you.
I'll pause for members to ask questions through the chat.
No questions.
Seeing no questions, I want to add a couple things. Rachel mentioned DROA. That's the Drought Reservoir Operation Agreement in the Upper Basin Drought Contingency Plan, and they are moving 181,000 acre-feet of water from crisp reservoirs above Lake Powell into Lake Powell between July and December, with the intent that it might protect some of the power generation resources produced by Glen Canyon Dam. Then in the lower basin, the August 24-month study triggered an adaptive management trigger for the lower basin drought contingency plan, and there's been a process ongoing between Arizona, California, Nevada, and the United States Bureau of Reclamation. And basically we need to, on top of the 07 guidelines, the drought contingency plan reductions, we need to find another 500,000 acre-feet a year for the next 5 years to keep Lake Mead from going below elevation 1020. So we have some huge challenges facing us on the Colorado River. And I'll bring this up now, and perhaps at the end we can talk about this among the whole group. We have not historically, I believe, talked much about hydropower resources when we talk about drought impacts in this group. We might start thinking about doing that and maybe identifying an entity like maybe the Irrigation and Electrical District Association or other entities that we might invite to become part of this group so they can report out on those power impacts that seem to be on the horizon potentially, at least in the Colorado River system. And we have tribal users, irrigation districts, cities, and others who do get power hydropower out of the CRISP, Colorado Restores Project Act, power generation. So might be something we should think about adding into our discussions moving forward. So with that, we'll move on to the next agenda item, item 6, Salt River and Verde River Watersheds Water Supply Report. And Stephen Fuller, Senior Hydrologist, Salt River Project, will lead that discussion. Go ahead, Stephen, and welcome.
Yes, hi. Yeah, thanks for having me here to share an update on the Salt River Verde River watersheds and the SRP water supply status. If you go to the next slide, we'll kind of take a look at where the reservoir system was before this monsoon season, and now actually, so you can see that as of late June, heading into the monsoon season, our reservoir system was still in pretty good shape, about 2/3 full at 67% overall. The Verde was fairly low at 30%, and the salt was about 73%. But our drought conditions were severe throughout much, severe to extreme throughout much of the Salt and Verde watershed, and exceptional in some areas, following the previous 12 to 15 months of dry year. So, and I'll kind of reference this water year to last water year. So if we go back a year earlier to the spring of 2020, the SRP reservoir system was fairly full, near full after nearly filling up after a wet 2020 winter. So if you look at water year 2020, it had a wet winter with above median inflows, followed by a record dry monsoon season in the summer of 2020. And then that record dry monsoon season led into a dry winter where we saw only about 104,000 acre feet of runoff, or about 19% of median, which was the second lowest this past winter in this water year, in water year 2021. And you can see that, and then as everyone's aware, this summer monsoon was above normal. So we kind of had a wet winter followed by a record dry monsoon, and then a near record dry winter now followed by a wet monsoon. So we'll kind of see what impact that has on the runoff in the reservoirs. But going into the monsoon season, the Verde was fairly low, but the salt was in good shape, and overall 2/3 full. So if you go to the next slide, what happened this monsoon season? Everyone's aware that we had in much of the state above normal precipitation. On the Salt and Verde, we had about 180% of normal, about 11.8 inches of average precipitation across the Salt and Verde. And that was actually the second wettest monsoon precipitation across the Salt and Verde watershed. And really the wettest in 100 years, because the only one higher was in 1919. So the wettest record in the last 100 years for the monsoon precipitation. And you can see certain areas like the White Mountains had higher amounts, and some isolated areas along the rim had higher amounts, but there were some higher than normal amounts as well as in the lower portions of the Salt and the Verde. Near Globe, we had the telegraph fire near there. So we saw some significant precipitation around there with some significant inflow and runoff, as well as the bush scar fire as well. We saw some significant precipitation around there, as well as additional runoff that I'll point out here in a minute. If you go to the next slide, you can see where we received the precipitation throughout the monsoon. You can see that we had quite a bit of precipitation throughout July. So a lot of that early July, late June, early July precipitation, we didn't see much runoff because of how dry it was leading into the monsoon. So we had to make up for that soil moisture deficit. But that big event there in late July, we started to see significant runoff, and then it continued through August. We saw 2 significant events, periods, timeframes in August. And overall, we saw that 11.8 inches, or 180% of normal. So we went from last monsoon season at 1.93 inches, a record low, to 11.8 this monsoon season, near a record high. But overall, for water year 2021, combined between the winter and the summer monsoon, we saw about 17 inches, or just slightly below normal. So near normal for water year 2021. If you go back to water year 2020, we saw just under 17, so 16.6 inches or so. So we saw very similar water year total precipitation for both water year 2020 and 2021. But it's really when the precipitation fell on how it impacted runoff and stream flow. Last year, it fell in 2020, it fell, majority of it fell in the winter, where we see that more productive runoff in the watershed, stream flow coming into the reservoirs. Whereas this year, the winter was very dry, and you had the summer with most of that precipitation observed in the summer, which did add some additional runoff, which we'll see here in a minute, but not near as much as what we do when we see a wet winter. Next slide. You can see the runoff throughout the summer monsoon. You can see the response starting with that late July storm, and then again in August and even into early September, particularly on the Salt. We saw flows on the Salt, Tonto, and Verde all up to or more than 10,000 CFS peaks. So pretty significant runoff peaks this monsoon season. We typically, these higher flows can occur in the monsoon, but typically see these from winter storm events and runoff. It also, as I mentioned, impacted the lower part, as well as the Salt, Tonto, and Verde coming into the reservoirs, seeing a significant amount of flow. It also saw some localized flow on those burn scar areas, the Telegraph Fire. Some of those peaks on the Salt, a lot of that was coming from Pinal and Pinto Creek, of some intense storms off the Telegraph Fire burn scar, as well as some impacts on the Verde River below Bartlett Dam coming from the bushfire from Sycamore Creek, as well as we saw one of the Verde large spikes in the Verde came from Sycamore Creek in the upper part of the watershed towards Williams, Flagstaff, that had the Raphael fire. We saw significant spikes there on the Verde as well for one of those events. If you go to the next slide, these are some images of some of the burn scar runoff monitoring cameras that we have on the lower Salt and lower Verde for the bushfire burn scar. You can see that in July, the first big events in July, we saw late July, we saw some moderate inflows into Saguaro and Canyon lakes. That picture on the left is Cottonwood Creek into Saguaro Canyon. And then we saw, again, the moderate peaks, Kitty Joe Creek, which is tributary to Sycamore Creek, which comes into the Verde below Bartlett, the lower Sycamore Creek. And then Slate Creek, which goes into Roosevelt, all saw significant debris runoff. Next slide, the August storms, we saw some even more significant runoff. That top one is that Kitty Joe Creek. And you can see the channel before this event. You can see this was the peak flow the camera captured there on August 18th. And you can see that entire bank channel is full. That bank there on the side, it might be hard to tell in the before picture, that's about 6 foot tall bank. So that's a lot of water coming down. And this is in the upper part of that watershed. So there's not a whole lot of watershed. So a lot of rain in that area. And you can see the change in the channel and the debris in the after picture. And then we saw about a little over 8,000 CFS come down the Sycamore Creek at the confluence with the Verde River there just above Granite Reef Dam. So for these events, next slide, SRP did have to make releases twice in August 12th and then August 18th due to these local runoff events below the reservoirs. Released up to 5,600 CFS from Granite Reef diversion about both times, with about 9,250 acre-feet total spilled for the month of August due to those local inflows below the reservoirs. Next slide. So if we look at total volume of runoff we saw in this past winter in 2021 versus the summer of 2021, you can see that the winter where we typically get a large amount of our inflow was near record low. We only got about 104,000 acre-feet total on the Salt, Tonto, and Verde for the winter, January through May. In the summer, we saw about 2.5 times that amount, which is fairly significant for the monsoon season runoff, with still below median for the below median for the winter runoff, but well above median for our summer runoff, with 257,000 acre-feet of runoff. And that was the 10th highest ranking runoff year on record for the monsoon season. You could probably, if we didn't have that soil moisture deficit to begin the season, it could have easily been the 4th wettest, as you can see on the table there. But the overall, the water year of 2021 total inflow was still about 420,000 acre-feet, which is still about 46% of median, so well below median for the water year. And if you compare that to water year of 2020, the previous year when we had the opposite, a wet winter and a dry summer, we saw just over 1 million acre-feet, or about 120% median. But both years, overall, the water years had the same precipitation, essentially. Next slide. How that impacted the reservoirs. The Verde system was fairly low coming into the summer monsoon to the dry winter. It actually added quite a significant amount to the Verde system. It went from 30% to 52% full, and that helped our managing of when we make our seasonal river swap. In October, we switch over to the Verde system for deliveries through what we were able to maintain that timing we typically have versus delaying that due to how low it was due to the previous winter, later into the winter and remaining on salt. So we swapped over to the Verde system the week of October 25th. The salt storage essentially stayed fairly level throughout the monsoon, and this is during a time of peak demand when we typically see reservoirs declining. So essentially having the salt storage stay level throughout the monsoon season was a significant amount of water that was not used or was maintaining throughout that peak summer demand of what was used. And you can see that help projections for the salt leading into this winter. A lower quartile we'll still see, but if we do end up, and as Mark mentioned, the outlook tends to be La Nina, which has a drier winter, so the chances of having a median or average inflow are less this year. But if that were to occur, it could potentially fill Roosevelt in the salt system. But with those projections for La Nina, not necessarily expected. The next slide, just to wrap up kind of where we're at now. If you compare this to the first slide, you can see that drought conditions throughout the Verde are now in salt along the rim and the higher elevations and abnormally dry to moderate and lower elevations. You can see that total system storage is pretty similar at 69%, actually slightly a little above where it was. Going into the monsoon, Verde is quite a bit above, and salt's about the same as it was. So last monsoon in 2020, the SRP storage during that July through September period, the SRP storage decreased 11%. This monsoon season, the SRP storage actually increased 3%. So it did quite make a difference in not necessarily adding to our total storage, but maintaining our storage throughout the summer. Next slide. And as was mentioned earlier, the La Nina conditions expect kind of below chances, more below normal chance for precipitation throughout the Salt and Verde going into the winter. The last month or so since the monsoons quieted down has been fairly dry and going into November. But the monsoon did increase soil moisture and quite a bit throughout the watershed. especially in the higher elevations. If we do start to see precipitation here later this fall, early winter, it'll help to maintain that. And if we do get some precipitation or snow throughout the watershed, we could maintain that to see more productive. But if it continues to stay dry throughout November, December, and into January, we may see that soil deficit emerge. And then if we get mid to late winter storms, they might have to reestablish that soil moisture deficit to start seeing more productive runoff. So it's kind of where we're at now going into the winter. Next slide. You can see again, despite that, SRP storage is still in good shape, 69%, following the very wet and high runoff for the monsoon season, which helped to maintain SRP. Reservoirs actually increased slightly over the peak demand, had small spills from local inflow, Granite Reef, and that monsoon has increased short-term drought conditions throughout the Salton Verde and improved runoff efficiencies. But with La Nina conditions going into the winter, those could dry out and having a greater chance for a drier than normal winter going into the season. I think the next one, if there's any questions, otherwise, I think that's all for the Salton Verde SRP water supply update.
We will pause for members to ask questions through the chat.
We have no questions.
I have one, Stephen, if you would know the answers. What is your projected groundwater surface water mix for SRP?
Yeah, so the surface water groundwater mix, it was due to how dry the winter was for this year. The previous winter before the monsoon season, it was increased to 125,000 groundwater, and I think that led to an increase to 2.7.6 for this current 2021. For next year, for 2022, I believe that goes up to 200,000 acre feet of groundwater, total groundwater use. So it increases the groundwater use, and I believe the mix is around 1.7 surface water, 1.6 groundwater.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So we can move on then to agenda item 7 of 2021 wildfire season update. Tiffany Davila, Public Affairs Officer for Arizona Department of Forestry and Fire Management. Welcome, Tiffany.
Thank you. Good morning. And again, we appreciate you inviting us to the presentation and meeting. If you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, please. So this is kind of what the outlook was going into 2021. We knew we were going to experience early fire activity just based off the winter from the prior year. We still had an overgrowth of grasses, and in areas that didn't burn in 2020, we knew we're going to burn this year. Again, that's just coupled with the precipitation, the drought situation, and then the carryover of fine fuel. We had early fire activity in May with the flag fire up in the Pine Lake area in Mojave County. Moving into June, we predicted that fire season would increase, and it would increase statewide. And that's exactly what we experienced. Basically, there was not one area that was not touched by fire in the state, anywhere from Coconino, the Prescott area, Pine Strawberry, down to Cochise, and of course, the Gila County area that experienced the bulk of fire activity this year. In July, we weren't really sure what monsoon season was going to look like this year. We knew we had heard that it was going to be pretty average, but coming off of 2020, when we really didn't have any monsoon, And that really pushed our fire season out well into October and early fall. We were kind of skeptical with what we were looking at this year, but monsoon season came. It produced a lot of rainfall across the state, and that really helped decrease our fire activity and new starts. We really haven't had much fire activity since July, August. We are seeing some roadside fires here and there, nothing, of major concern, that are getting picked up pretty quickly. And that's just due to the vegetation still being moist from the rainfall that we experienced. But unlike last year we just had fire activity that pushed into October, November. We had no monsoon season, so we just experienced those dry lightning storms with the lightning and no rainfall. And this year we were able to decrease that fire activity quickly as soon as monsoon season arrived in July. Next slide, please. So this is what we're kind of looking at for the 2021 activity. We've had 1,600 plus fires for about 532,000 acres. Last year, this same time, 2,300 fires, 954,000 acres burned. And then in 2020 total, from January 1st to December 31st, we had 2,500 fires for almost 1 million acres burned. Again, that increase in 2020 was just because our fire season extended, because we didn't have that precipitation that we usually get in July. Once monsoon season rolls in, really helps bring that, increase that humidity, brings that rainfall, and thus decreases our fire activity. We didn't have that last year, so that's why we have the bulk of the acres burned. And then last year also, we had all of that excess fuel just across the state, especially in the Sonoran Desert area. And that's why in 2020, we had a lot of fires within the Superstition Wilderness area, on the Tono National Forest, North Phoenix, in the Scottsdale area, whereas this year it was more widespread across the state. And then again, monsoon season really helped decrease that fire activity. These numbers encompass state, federal, and tribal lands as well. Next slide, please. This is kind of the bulk of our activity this year. Obviously, the Telegraph Fire, 180,000 acres in the Globe, Miami area. That area experienced the bulk of our fire activity this year. The Raphael Fire on the Prescott. The Mescal Fire, again, near Globe, that was on the BLM, 72,000 acres. The Pinnacle Fire, also in that, kind of in that same area, 34,000 acres. And then we had the Margot Fire. So you can just see the bulk of the activity this year was Pinal, Gila County area, Globe, Miami, Superior, all of that, of that region. Also destructive this year as far as structures lost. For instance, not sure how many of you have been to Dudleyville. It's not that large of a community. On the Margot Fire alone, we lost 40 plus structures. 18 of those were primary. So when we say primary, we're talking a home that somebody may live in, whether that's a mobile home, a modular home, or a single family residence. And then the remainder of those structures were secondary buildings, so a garage, a shed, things of that nature. But alone on that Margot Fire, just 40 structures. So, and then we had property loss on the Telegraph Fire as well. Next slide, please. I know some of these charts are going to be very similar, but we kind of just wanted to give you an idea of what we were looking at going into fire season this year, and then where we are now. So obviously the drought impacts everybody. It affects us in more ways than just the fuel conditions. We had some challenges this year getting water to some areas, to some fires, especially in our more rural communities. What we usually do when we get water in our rural areas is we're able to use some landowners' water supplies, whether that's for their livestock or whatnot. But because of the drought situation and the water, we weren't able to use some of those water resources. We chose not to, because we didn't want to deplete those water supplies for the ranchers who needed that water for their livestock. So there was some challenges for us this year in terms of using our water resources to suppress fire, coupled with obviously the dry conditions, obviously statewide, as you can see by the March 9th drought monitor map. the dry fuel, the lack of rainfall, the La Nina that we had in 2020, and then as compared to what we're looking at now. So that rain really helped get us out of that active fire situation. But then again, now we have that double-edged sword because fire stops, and now we have these disastrous mudslides and flooding issues that we experienced again, where we had these burn areas, the Telegraph fire, areas up in northern Arizona where we had the museum fire a couple years ago. So we're still seeing that after effects of the burn when we have these heavy rainfalls in these areas. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to throw this in here also. This year, the governor passed House Bill 2001 shortly after the Telegraph fire and the Mescal fire started in Gila County. The bulk of this money is going to be going to our post-fire flood mitigation, which we've already allocated a handful of money out. That's for items like sandbagging equipment, areas that experience flooding, counties to help them secure their areas, and then they can use that equipment and use whatever those purchases are for years to come. Just because they experienced flooding this year, they're going to continue to experience flooding until that vegetation grows back, until we're able to get into those areas and repair those areas with seedlings and other vegetation. Also under the House Bill 2001, this was a $100 million bill. 25 million went to the Healthy Forest Initiative. This is kind of to increase the amount of fuels work across the state to get more boots on the ground. With this, again, we're partnering with the Department of Corrections. In the next 2 years, we're hoping to have 720 inmates helping with fuels work across the state. So again, this is just trying to put more boots on the ground to target more of our at-risk areas across Arizona. We have a handful of projects lined up right now. Some are active and in process. Others are coming down the pipeline. And this will also go to our prescribed burning efforts, which will be starting next week. Excuse me, 19 million will go to our wildfire suppression funding, 10 million for capital expenditures. So we're able to purchase things like we need new radio equipment. So we'll be getting new radio equipment for all of our wildland firefighters, new towers. It's just a safety issue. So that money will go to help with our expenditures and purchase what we need to move forward for wildfire suppression. And then 10 million was allocated for emergency repair to public and private infrastructure that was damaged by the wildfires or wildfire suppression efforts. Next slide, please. And this is, I kind of just broke this down as to what House Bill 2001 looks like. Of the 36 million that I spoke to about the post-fire flooding mitigation, 8 million of that, we've already allocated 10 million. In that 10 million, 8 million went to Gila County alone. So you can just see how big the need was in that area. The money that Gila County is using for sandbagging machines, sandbags, sand, barricades. They bought concrete barriers to help protect their hospital, heavy equipment, and then flood warning gauge sensors. And that's just a few of the items. Obviously, there's hundreds of more items. Personnel expenditures to help with the flooding mitigation efforts. So again, of that 10 million we've allocated, 8 million went to Gila County alone. 335,000 has been approved for assistance under the emergency infrastructure portion of the bill. So this money is going to be doled out to help with that emergency infrastructure repair. Anything, people lost their fencing for their livestock, their water supply, or their water infrastructure, their wells, things of that nature. So that money will go to help with that. And then under the $25 million Healthy Forest Initiative, we've got 31 projects that are active or planned throughout the state. 9 of those which are going to be prescribed burns this year. Again, we're going to be starting our burns next week. Next slide, please. So now that we talked about 2021, what are we looking at for 2022? Well, that all depends on what this winter brings. I know everyone's talking about La Nina forecast for winter and then moving into the spring. Again, with that, we've all heard that the La Nina is going to bring warmer than normal conditions, possibly a lack of rainfall over the winter. that's just gonna, contribute to that overgrowth of grasses from the monsoon. So again, it's that double-edged sword. We need all of this moisture. We want all of this moisture. And now we just have this influx of grass across the Sonoran Desert. That overgrowth of grasses from the monsoon likely to create that abundance of dry grass come spring. If we have a warm winter, that fuel is going to dry out faster. And that could lead to an early start to our fire activity, especially in the fine fuel vegetation fuel type, the grass and the brush. They don't hold a lot of moisture to begin with, so they dry out faster than a vegetation type you'd find up in northern Arizona like the timber. And that's why when we talk about our outlooks for fire season, we always say we're going to be active more in the central area, southern Arizona first, because of that fuel, that vegetation type in these areas. It takes a little longer for that vegetation to dry out in northern Arizona. The timber, that type of fuel holds moisture longer, so it takes a while for that to dry out as opposed to the fuel or the brush, the fine fuel grass or brush. And then again, the potential for early fire activity across the Sonoran Desert where this fuel type lives. So, we're kind of just looking out a couple months ahead. We know that La Nina is forecast for the winter. We won't really have a better idea of what we're looking at for 2022 until we get into the early, the January, February months and see what we're looking at for the spring. Next slide, please. And that's all I have. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask.
Thank you. I'll pause a minute for folks to ask questions through the chat.
Questions?
Seeing none, thanks, Tiffany, and we'll move on to agenda item 8, impacts of drought on the Gila River Indian community. Jason Howder from Aiken Gum Strauss Howard and Feld LLP is going to give that presentation, and I think the Gila Indian community and Jason are new to this process. I've been working with Jason on a variety of issues for the last half a dozen years. So welcome, Jason.
Thank you, Tom. And Governor Lewis sends his regards. And thank you for everyone else on the coordinating group here. Today, a brief presentation. I really wanted to focus on the community's Colorado River supplies that it receives through the Central Arizona Project. And I'll summarize how the drought impacting the Colorado River impacts the community and what the community has been doing to try to mitigate these impacts, both on the community, but also as part of this larger effort that Tom alluded to within the state of Arizona and in the lower basin. Go to the next slide, the first slide. So I want to provide a little bit of context for community CAP water. When the community settled its claims to the Gila River and its claims are to the Gila River and its tributaries, the community agreed to take CAP water as an in lieu supply to resolve its claims. And this was not an easy decision for the community because CAP water has two issues, I think, that the community is confronting now and knew it would have to confront. The first is it's a more expensive water supply. Its Gila River water that it receives has very little cost or no cost in terms of delivery. And the other issue is that it's a lower priority in the Colorado River system. And so it's an at-risk supply in terms of drought. In contrast, the community's Gila River water, it has an immemorial priority. It has the earliest priority date of any water user. That's not to say that there's not issues with the Gila River water in terms of drought impact, because I think you've seen in the maps in showing drought in western New Mexico, which is the Gila River watershed. The community has been receiving less Gila River water than it has in the past, but the community has a higher priority of that. Anyway, those are two issues that made this decision not an easy decision, but it ultimately decided to take CAP water as part of its settlement, which made it the single largest entitlement holder of CAP water of 311,800 acre feet. The community has both non-Indian ag priority CAP water and M&I priority water. The community's NIA priority is most at risk in periods of drought. Under the tier 1 shortage or level 1 shortage, the unmitigated impact to the community's non-Indian ag priority water is about 70,000 acre feet reduction. Under tier 2 or worse, the community loses all of this water if it's not mitigated in terms of wet water deliveries. Of its M&I supply, the community has a little over 70,000 acre feet that is not under contract. The communities has entered into a number of leases in exchange, many of which were part of its settlement. And so most of these contracts are for 100 years. Although of this amount, about 15,000 acre feet returns to the community in 2045 because that's part of a 25-year exchange with CAGRIT, and that expires in 2045. Next slide, please. So in terms of on-reservation impacts with respect to CAP supply, currently the community only relies on about 20 to 40,000 acre feet for its on-reservation demand. So it has between 150 to 107,000 acre feet of what I would call an annual flex supply that is primarily comprised of non-Indian ag priority water within CAP supplies. So lately, the community has used much of this water for Lake Mead conservation efforts as part of the DCP implementation and to help with the current poor hydrology. Prior to the DCP, much of this water, this flex supply, was delivered to groundwater savings facilities to create long-term storage credits. And among those GSFs, many were in the Powell EMA. The shift in use of this water for Lake Mead conservation has reduced supplies for groundwater savings facilities within the Phoenix and Powell EMAs, but particularly in the Powell EMA. Now, the community decided to make this shift because it wants to protect its flex supply, which is only a significant volume of water if we are in a tier 1 or better condition. Under the DCP, there's a tier 0, and then there's actually a better. We're out of all the tiers, I think, at a much higher elevation in Lake Mead. But for the community to have access to this, a good portion of its NIA priority water, it really needs to be out of a tier 1 or better. So as a result, the community has been steadfast in its support of all efforts to keep Lake Mead from falling below tier 1, and is really, early on during the DCP talks, is really trying to find ways to keep in a tier 0 situation as long as possible. So next slide, please. So this is a graph of the contributions to Lake Mead. The light blue is system conservation, which the community first started doing in 2016. The dark blue is intentionally created surplus or stored water in Lake Mead. And the green in the last column there is looking forward to next year, when the community will have a DCP reduction, a reduction to wet water supplies under the DCP implementation. So this, through 2022, with anticipated contributions in 2022, the total contributions to Lake Mead is about 540,000 acre feet since 2016. And 2016 is really when the community started getting, in late 2015, early 2016 is when the community started really focusing on the conditions in the Colorado River and Lake Mead. And that first year was 10,000 acre feet of the pilot system conservation agreement that it entered into. And then the following year, it entered into a larger system conservation agreement of 80,000 acre feet where the city of Phoenix, state of Arizona, and the United States were all parties to that agreement. And so it did 90,000 acre feet prior to DCP being approved. And then once it was approved in 2019, part of the community's requirements or obligations under the DCP was to create 200,000 acre feet of ICS, or stored water, in Lake Mead. For 150,000 acre feet of that would be for future firming supplies for both the United States and the state of Arizona. So in 2019, the community stored 117,000 acre feet in Lake Mead, and then the following year, 2020, it stored 83,000 acre feet in Lake Mead to meet that obligation under the DCP. And then this year, it is voluntarily conserved 40,000 acre feet, or stored 40,000 acre feet as part of additional ICS. And then recently, mid-year, entered into another system conservation agreement with the United States for another 40,000 acre feet. Go to the next slide, please. So going into 2022 and then 2023, the community is planning to contribute nearly 173,000 acre feet toward Lake Mead next year. Now, 62% of that, or 62,000 acre feet of that, is part of the DCP. That is already something that the community's agreed to, and it's forgoing a substantial amount of wet water mitigation under the DCP agreement. The community kind of backstopped mitigation supplies by agreeing to take paid mitigation rather than wet water mitigation. So its reductions in wet water supplies is 62,000 acre feet under the DCP next year in a tier 1 shortage. The community, in our recent discussions with Central Arizona Project, SRP, the state of Arizona, the United States, about the state meeting helping to meet this 500,000 acre feet per year conservation goal that Tom mentioned earlier. The community is committed next year to up to 111,000 acre feet of additional conservation in the form of ICS and system conservation. I would want to emphasize that to get to this number, the community is now talking to its own farming, the Gila River Farms, and discussing and asking them to consider fallowing around 4,000 acres. And so next week, there's that the Gila River Farm Board will be considering that, of taking 4,000 acres out of fallowing 4,000 acres, and this will be really the first time the community is not for conservation purposes if they decide to go this route. I think it's very likely they will, but I just wanted to point that out. I think really we hope, the community hopes, the collective efforts of the lower basin will keep us in tier 1 in 2023 as well. And if that happens, assuming this is the case, the community will have another fairly large amount of water that it can contribute in 2023. I think one of the not an uncertainty, but a complicating factor, or something that just needs to be addressed, is in the community's obligation or willingness to create a large amount of ICS, 78,000 acre feet, in an agreement with the United States this coming year. What that's done is, once the community does that, the state of Arizona's accumulation limit of stored water in Lake Mead will be maxed out, essentially. So there's not a lot of room for additional stored water in Lake Mead. So additional conservation efforts in 2023 will have to be system conservation. And let's go to the next slide. So in terms of impact to the community, really what the drought has done is caused the community to shift its water use from in-state storage to Lake Mead storage and conservation. Next year will be the first time the community is directly impacted, potentially, if the farms agree to fallow land. In the past, the community has supplies to meet its on-reservation demands, and really, if the community decides to fallow land, that's a voluntary program. It's not that it's short of supplies. The community is committed to continue to take actions to reduce its reliance on CAP water, CAP water, so it can be as drought resilient as possible. And it's committed to working with other stakeholders, with the state of Arizona, other stakeholders, and in the lower basin, to help Arizona adjust to the new normal. So I think the community has found that it's very good partners in the state, wants to be helpful as possible. I want to thank Tom for his leadership and on the recent efforts and with respect to the DCP and the upcoming efforts in additional conservation in Lake Mead. So anyway, Governor Lewis passes on his best, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thanks, Jason. We'll pause for questions in the chat. Just add a couple things, Jason, and for the group. First, DWR and CAP are working on a fact sheet on the 500 plan, so to speak, the 500,000 acre feet a year for 5 years. We hope to have that up on our websites relatively soon, hopefully by the end of the week. We'll give some of the additional actions that are be taken beyond this participation by the community. And just for some context, Jason had a slide about the community conserving 540,000 acre feet of water in Lake Mead. That is approximately, and this is certainly not an exact number, 7 feet out of the 65 feet that has been conserved collectively in Arizona, California, Nevada, and Mexico, and actions by the U.S. as well since 2014 in Lake Mead. So it's a substantial contribution by the community. And you heard the detail which Jason gave about how they have to juggle a lot of their water uses, their water supplies to help make that happen. They, along with some other entities, Colorado Indian tribes, cities, and others, agriculture as well, really have stepped up to the plate, both with DCP and in our 500 plan to help us protect the falling elevations from Lake Mead. And I brought up earlier that we have this obligation now to try to protect elevation 1020 in Lake Mead, the next step, so to speak, in the drought contingency plan. So again, Jason, you can give my regards and thanks as well to Governor Lewis for all the efforts of the community. And with that, now we are into a discussion of the drought declaration recommendation. Just some quick background. As an advisory body to the governor, we'll consider the updates we've heard today from all of the speakers. The drought declaration that's been in effect maintains the state's ability to provide emergency response, receive federal assistance when needed. As I have done in the past, I'm going to first turn to my co-chair, Gene Wickel, to give his view of what we heard and his idea on the recommendation. We'll have an opportunity for members to also give their view, and perhaps I'll weigh in as well if anything needs to be added. I also want to give opportunity for the public to weigh in, since this is an action item. We always have the call to the public at the end, but I'd like to give opportunity for them to weigh in before the group makes a decision. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Gene.
Good morning, everyone. This is Gene Weichel, Senior Assistant Director at DEMA on behalf of Alan Clark, who's out of the office this week. I want to thank everyone for the comprehensive and in-depth presentations. They were very informative. I certainly learned a lot with regards to what you've presented and the ongoing drought that we have. And based upon the material that's been presented and the recommendation that's been drafted, I certainly would endorse continuing forth with a drought declaration to the governor. That's all that I have, pending any questions.
Thanks, Gene, and thanks for correcting the pronunciation of your name. With a name like Wyshatsky, I always try to pay attention to those types of things. Thanks for your recommendation. Other members of the group want to weigh in. If you put your name in the chat, we'll be able to unmute and speak to the rest of the group? Seeing none so far, I'll just agree with Gene in terms of the recommendation. We've heard that La Nina is here, and we expect it to stay within our state, that it will be drier and warmer than normal. We see some short-term relief from the monsoon, but that's starting to shift again. Long-term, we're not seeing anything on the horizon that would make us think we're heading out of the drier and warmer conditions. The Colorado River Basin report was dismal, as we all probably already knew. We're going into Tier 1, as we heard, a 512,000 acre-foot reduction of Colorado River water supplies to Arizona. We heard from Salt River Project that they're going to be increasing their groundwater pumping next year, and we heard about fires burning in 2020 and 2021. So all in all, it seems to be pretty much of a no-brainer that we would want to continue and make the recommendation to continue the drought declaration. But before we put that to bed, are there any members of the public? You can put your request or comment in the chat, and I'll pause for that to happen before you put this to bed.
We have a comment from Mark O'Malley. He wrote, "I second the recommendation."
Thanks, Mark. Anyone else, members or public? Hearing none, we will make that recommendation to the governor. Staff will draft up a letter for me to send off to the governor making that recommendation. And we'll then move to the final agenda item, item 10, comments on the 2021 Arizona Drought Preparedness Annual Report. Again, DWR is required to submit an annual report to the governor's office by the end of the fiscal year for the previous water year. The 2021 report covers the drought conditions and drought preparedness activities for this water year, October 1st, 2020 through September 30th, 2021, this past water year. Again, includes a summary of Arizona's drought status this past water year, outlook for the next water year, the drought designation information, highlights or maybe lowlights of the drought condition, as your view might be, and preparedness activities, and all the other efforts that the work groups and the community put into this program. So I will thank all of those who already provided updates to the report. We had sent that out to all of you, to the members, last week. I will pause and ask if there are any additional comments or questions at this point in time from the members of the group. And you can go through the chat if you would like.
We don't have comments about the report. We have one comment from Susan Chase about the previous topic about, yes, continuing the declaration.
Go ahead.
Just to continue the declaration.
Oh, yes, that she supports continuing. Okay, thank you. All right, so we will do a final review of the report, catch any typos or those types of non-substantive changes, if there are any, and be submitting that to the governor's office with the recommendation letter and posting that on the department's drought webpage, which you can see here on the screen. We've done the call to the public on both of those items. So I think we are into closing remarks. I'd just like, again, to reiterate what I brought up earlier and maybe ask for some quick feedback from members of the group as to their view on perhaps adding a power user entity to our discussions. It could be CREDA, Colorado Electrical District Association, could be the Arizona Power Authority, it could be the Irrigation and Electrical District Association. We probably have several choices, but just conceptually, are there folks that disagree that we should perhaps add the power sector into our deliberations on drought recommendation? And I'll pause. And if I don't hear any concerns by any of the members, I will take that as a yes and work with staff on how we would make that happen for the next meeting in May.
Okay.
And I'm not seeing any concerns being raised by that addition. Hopefully in May also, as we have had historically, the Navajo Nation will be one of the speakers, hoping to continue to have the Gila River Indian community as well be on the agenda to hear from them as well. So with that, I thank everyone for their participation and all the work that you do in between these big biannual meetings. And I know there's lots of work by lots of folks that are part of this coordinating group in that regard. And thank my staff as well for their work. So with that, we are adjourned. Thank you.